Do you know that in A Bug's Life? Do you know that in Addams Family Values? Do you know that in American Psycho? Do you know that in Avengers Age of Ultron? Do you know that in Avengers Endgame? Do you know that in Avengers Infinity War? Do you know that in Avengers Infinity War? Do you know that in Batman Returns? Do you know that in Big Hero 6? Do you know that in Black Panther? Do you know that in Cars 3? Do you know that in Deadpool 2? Do you know that in Django Unchained? Do you know that in Doctor Strange? Do you know that in Doctor No? Do you know that in Enchanted? Do you know that in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind? Do you know that in Everything Everywhere All at Once? Do you know that in Forrest Gump? Do you know that in Heat? Do you know that in Hercules? Do you know that in Into the Wild? Do you know that in Jaws? Do you know that in John Wick? Do you know that in Joker? Do you know that in Kill Bill Volume 2? Do you know that in Kingsman: The Golden Circle? Do you know that in Kingsman: The Secret Service? Do you know that in Kingsman: The Secret Service? Do you know that in Knives Out? Do you know that in Knives Out? Do you know that in Kung Fu Panda? Do you know that in Mean Girls? Do you know that in Ocean's 11? Do you know that in On Her Majesty's Secret Service? Do you know that in Paddington? Do you know that in Paranorman? Do you know that in Pirates of the Caribbean? Do you know that in Saving Mr. Banks? Do you know that in Saving Mr. Banks? Do you know that in Saving Mr. Banks? Do you know that in Saving Private Ryan? Do you know that in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World? Do you know that in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World? Do you know that in Singing in the Rain? Do you know that in Spaceballs? Do you know that in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse? Do you know that in Spider-Man? Do you know that in The Big Lebowski? Do you know that in The Emperor's New Groove? Do you know that in The Evil Dead? Do you know that in The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring? Do you know that in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers? Do you know that in The Prince of Egypt? Do you know that in The Spy Who Loved Me? Do you know that in Toy Story 2? Do you know that in Tremors? Do you know that in Tron? Do you know that in Tropic Thunder? Do you know that in War of the Worlds? Do you know that in Wreck-It Ralph? Do you know that in Titanic? Do you know that for 8 Mile? Do you know that for 50 First Dates? Do you know that for Airplane? Do you know that for Baby Driver? Do you know that for Batman Begins? Do you know that for Beauty and the Beast? Do you know that for Big Hero 6? Do you know that for Captain America? Do you know that for Coraline? Do you know that for Deadpool? Do you know that for Dogma? Do you know that for Fight Club? Do you know that for Fight Club? Do you know that for Fight Club? Do you know that for Frozen? Do you know that for Get Out? Do you know that for Ghostbusters? Do you know that for Gladiator? Do you know that for Guardians of the Galaxy? Do you know that for How the Grinch Stole Christmas? Do you know that for Inglourious Bastards? Do you know that for Iron Man? Do you know that for Lilo and Stitch? Do you know that for Mean Girls? Do you know that for Men in Black? Do you know that for Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Do you know that for Napoleon Dynamite? Do you know that for Paranormal Activity? Do you know that for Poltergeist? Do you know that for Pulp Fiction? Do you know that for Rogue One? Do you know that for Schindler's List? Do you know that for Scooby-Doo? Do you know that for Seven? Do you know that for Spaceballs? Do you know that for Spider-Man Homecoming? Do you know that for Spider-Man? Do you know that for Star Wars: A New Hope? Do you know that for Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back? Do you know that for Star Wars? Do you know that for Star Wars? Do you know that for Stop or My Mom Will Shoot? Do you know that for Superman? Do you know that for Super Mario Brothers? Do you know that for The Aviator? Do you know that for The Hangover? Do you know that for The Lion King? Do you know that for The Little Mermaid? Do you know that for The Mask? Do you know that for The Naked Gun? Do you know that for The Outsiders? Do you know that for The Prestige? Do you know that for The Rock? Do you know that for The Terminator? Do you know that for The Truman Show? Do you know that for Thor: Love and Thunder? Do you know that for Toy Story? Do you know that for Turning Red? Do you know that for WALL-E? Do you know that for War Games? Do you know that in 500 Days of Summer?